Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out on this wonderful spring day. It's wonderful to see the warm weather back, and I know everybody's enjoying, like I am, getting out and doing a bit of biking and walking and so forth. My name is Murray Fulton. I am the director of the Johnson Shyama Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm delighted to be your MC today. As we gather here today, we acknowledge we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We are also video conferencing to Treaty 4 territory. The video conferencing is going to Regina, so we are also want to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 4 territory. And we would like to pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And I think that particular message is particularly relevant for the talk that you're going to hear this afternoon, and a little bit more on that later. I also would like to welcome you to the Gordon Oaks Red Bear Student Center. I'd like to thank the Gordon Oaks Center very much for co-hosting this event with the Johnson Shyama Graduate School of Public Policy. And I just want to say they've been wonderful to work with. I mentioned just a moment ago that we are connecting by video to the University of Regina. And I would also just like to acknowledge that we are live streaming this event to people all over the world. And I'm not exactly sure where everyone is, but I know from some of the emails that I got that we are going to a number of places across Canada, in fact, around the world. There's a few people let me just jump here. Okay, sorry. Earlier this morning, Elder Roland Duquette led a number of us, including our guest speaker this afternoon and our other visitor from Harvard, so Joe Kalt and Megan Hill, in a ceremony. He welcomed our guests and shared his teaching about connectedness and the land. He prayed for our good discussion and safe travels. Protocol was observed and accepted. Thank you, Elder Duquette. I would like to just acknowledge a few of the people that are here today and or joining us by video. In Regina, Perry Bellegarde and Edmund Bellegarde are joining us. And here in this audience, just a quick mention of Dr. Jackie Ottman, and you will be hearing a little bit more from her lately, and Eugene Arcand. So thank you very much for joining us. I would now like to invite Vice Chief David Pratt to bring words of greeting from FSIN.
Thank you for that introduction. Gitatumska Tinawao, Aninchaga, Glenete, Haukuda. I greet all of you this afternoon. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to be with you here today in such an important event. First of all, I want to bring greetings on behalf of our Chief, Bobby Cameron, and our provincial organization with the 74-member First Nations here in the Saskatchewan region. I have to recognize the important work that's being undertaken here today in terms of education. You know, education was used as a tool to attack Indigenous nations and to assimilate us within Canada. And I believe that education is going to be a pivotal and the main role in terms of undoing all of the damages that were done from government policy, whether it's residential schools, with the continuation of today with the child welfare system. And I just want to commend you for the work that you're doing. I want to acknowledge our former Chancellor, Blaine Murray, for being here today, Candace Wascase Lafferty, Vice Provost Ottman, Eugene Arcan, no stranger to many of us in the room, former executive member, as well as all the work him and Lorna are doing in terms of reconciliation. So I want to, first of all, say let's have a good afternoon, and I'm looking forward to hearing the presentation today, and we welcome our esteemed guest from Harvard, and we're looking for how we can continue to work together and collaborate in a lot of ways, and building upon those partnerships with Harvard and other post-secondary institutions. So with that, thank you, Mercy Cho, hi, and let's have a great day.
Thank you, David. I would now like to invite Blaine Murray, Chancellor Emeritus, to come to the podium to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Blaine.
Thank you, Murray. Murray's doing a great job. Let's give him a round of applause. He's working on his jokes, as will I. Speaking of jokes, humorous man in the back, Vice Chief Arcand, welcome, Big Bird, to this building again and the support you provide to campus. Vice Chief Pratt, thanks for your words, and all the people from the university that are here supporting. It's my pleasure to welcome Joe Kalt to Saskatoon, to Treaty 6 territory, and Megan Hill, his colleague from Harvard. If you can give us everybody a wave, Megan, so everybody knows who you are. The program that we're talking about is a program that Joe initiated 20 years ago called Honoring Nations. I attended in October, I think, this year in Denver, Colorado, the award that they gave for this year. They gave out 5 awards. And I was really struck by the communities were there. It wasn't unlike the Aboriginal Achievement Awards where they honor one person, which I think is unfair because it takes a community to do something. They honor these communities. So from California, I think it was a justice system, and I think there was an economic development system, agriculture system from an Oklahoma tribe. And what they try to do, what Joe and his team have tried to do, is this whole concept that we talk about here in Canada of best practices, separating politics from the business for our Indian leadership in doing business. All of this stuff are concepts that actually Joe and his team at Harvard have come up with. They're so disseminated across the fabric of Indian country in the United States and in Canada. They think that's what they called it in the States, is Indian country. And it's all Indian country as far as we're concerned, Turtle Island. But it's very helpful because it lifts up the communities. And so they use it to create new research. They use it to identify leaders. They use it to change attitudes and perspectives. And so you're coming to the good place, Joe, on this campus here. We have Saskatchewan's an interesting place. It's lots of Cree and Saulteaux and Ojibwe and Dene people here, Assiniboine people, Sioux people. I've been here for centuries, and we had our own ways of doing things, and we're dealing with settler societies. We're going through this process of reconciliation due to the work of the Royal Commission and the Residential School Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But the work that I think that Joe and them do lift other communities up. And so what we're trying to do is lift all of the Canadian communities up by bringing applied research, bring our smartest thinkers that are doing public policy work, our best economists, our best medical researchers, partnering with the communities, doing case studies, lifting them up, working together, learning the academics, learning about the situation in the communities, and giving some real practical approaches for change. And that's what's great about this program, is because I spent a lot of time on campuses, and some things are really inspiring but not practical, and some things are just practical and help people, and this is in the second category. Really practical, helps a lot of folks. So I'm giving a long talk, but I want to talk a little bit about Joe Kalt and why we should be very honored that he's joined us today. I went horse riding with Joe about 20 years ago when I was a student of his, went cutting horses, and I spent a couple days with him and got to know him really well. And I asked him one time, what's the thing that made you kind of famous, Joe? And because you're always curious about people's stories. And he said what he started out was, he's an economist. He's a very well-regarded, internationally known economist. And he was the witness for the plaintiffs against Howard Hughes, who owned all the land around Las Vegas, because way back in the days of, he's not that old a Bugsy Siegel, but quite a while ago, and they couldn't develop Vegas because Howard Hughes owned all the land, so they created an antitrust, and he was the witness. And now, he's been Canada's friend to Canada. He's been Canada's representative at the World Trade Organization as our expert witness on softwood lumbers, on the unfairness of the duties that America puts on us sometimes, and a bunch of other countries. He won awards from the Native American tribes for the first American Leadership Award for public policy affecting Native peoples. He and Professor Cornell received the National Congress of American Indians, which is their AFN, the United States, for public sector leadership. So Our hope is that we bring honoring nations to the University of Saskatchewan. This is the right place to bring it in Canada. We're the leader in this country on Indigenous knowledge and commitment to reconciliation. And I think that I'm an alumni of both places. I'm proud of both places very much. And I think that I could not be more happy if this could come to our province. And I think that we'll get the money for you. I think the university commitment is there. We met with the president earlier and a bunch of interested people around campus. So please welcome Joe Kalt, and let's show some Saskatchewan hospitality and let's listen to a story. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Blaine. Blaine's a former student, and I noticed he was introduced as Chancellor Emeritus, and you see in my title I have this word emeritus. It's a fancy Latin word for old, cranky, and useless. So tell my grown children, tell me. Well, thank you very much. It's truly an honor to be here. I'm honored to be on the lands of the traditional peoples of this area and to be presented with such a beautiful day here. We're here today, we're spending a couple days talking about this program that Blaine just mentioned called Honoring Nations. In the United States, we don't spell it with a U, so we'll keep each other's programs separate. The Honoring Nations program, and the director of the Honoring Nations program, Megan Hill, is right down there. The Honoring Nations program is dedicated to try to find, share, and disseminate the lessons of best practices in tribal self-governance among the U.S. American Indian tribes. And I'm going to talk today not so much about that program, but about why we formed that program. But this Honoring Nations program is trying to change the conversation across Turtle Island to show what works. We all know there are tremendous problems out there. We all know there is a history of oppression. There is a history of disempowerment. We all know the horrible things that have happened. And yet at the same time, some Native communities are doing some phenomenally good things. And in the process, they're teaching other Native communities and other non-Native communities around the world how to engage in good self-governance to build a community and make it strong. And so what I'm going to that's what Honoring Nations is about. It's a program that goes through nominations and awards, and we have an illustrious board of governors that selects what they call in the States the Academy Awards of Indian Country, where we make awards for outstanding achievements to, as Blaine said, not to individuals, yes, there are tremendous individuals, but to whole communities who figure out how to do everything from rebuild a juvenile justice system, to build a good water and sewer system, to protect the environment, to build an economy, all of these things that go into building a nation. And so what we're here to talk with University of Saskatchewan about is a Canadian version of this, and we're off and running, and it'll be a fabulous thing, and I appreciate all the support that we've found here at the University of Saskatchewan. Well, let me begin by just briefly saying a word about this thing, my title up there, co-director of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, and tell you a little bit about that. It's a misnomer. We should have changed the title ages ago, because it's not about economic development. This work started out, a little autobiography, two very wet behind the ears white nerdy professors and our equally nerdy Navajo graduate student looking around US Indian country at a time in the mid-1980s in which, after decades of sort of uniform poverty, we were talking earlier today in some of our discussions about haves and have-nots across Indian America. 30 years ago, it was all have-nots. And suddenly there started to appear some communities that were breaking those patterns, starting to get some jobs, starting to improve public health on their own reserves and so forth. And so we started doing some research, the two nerdy white professors and their equally nerdy Navajo graduate student. And I'm an economist by training. The other professor is a sociologist. Our Navajo graduate student was in education. And we would drive around in the rental car talking to these tribes who were showing this sort of breaking away and breaking the patterns of poverty and so forth. And we would fight, the nerds would fight over, oh, it's all economics. No, the education guy said it's all education. And the sociologists would talk about things I couldn't even understand, something about social structures or something. And what started to happen was, when you looked around, the places that were making a difference in the lives of day-to-day people and changing the communities were the ones who governed themselves well. The ones who govern themselves well. Without capable, stable government, you couldn't hold on to a good language teacher. You couldn't hold on to the grant that you got last year to rebuild some houses. Everything seemed to fall apart if the center or the core was falling apart. It's not the only challenge in nation building, but it's a key challenge. That unless you can organize in a way that can hold on to talent and keep it, everything else tends to fall apart. And so we've become, the focus of our work has turned out to be on the governance of indigenous nations. Not where I thought we would end up. I was all about natural resources and capital. That's what economists focus on. But that's what our focus has become. And you can hear it in our discussion of honoring nations, where we are focused on best practices in tribal government, whatever the dimension might be, economic, social, environmental, whatever. And I'm going to start the substance of this talk with a proposition for you. Try to convince you in the course of the next, they said 40 minutes, but I'll take a little longer. Megan knows, so does Robin, some of my former students. Here's the proposition. True self-government, and by that I mean the implementation of self-determined collective decisions reflecting each indigenous community's own values, needs, and circumstances, made through and implemented by institutions of self-rule, designed and run by that community. True self-government is the only policy that has ever worked to reverse the imposed ravages of poverty, social distress, disempowerment, and dispossession. Now I want to say a word about, I'm obviously emphasizing this, true self-government. I don't mean apologies. I don't mean reconciliation. I don't mean free, prior, and informed consent. I don't mean consultation. I mean, how about power to make the decision whether that mine occurs on your reserve land? How about the power to determine whether or not that forest gets harvested, and so on? True self-government, I don't mean apologies. I don't mean reconciliation. I don't mean free, prior, and informed consent. I mean true self-government, where you're not only a voice at the table, you're a decision maker at the table. Because what we're finding is that true self-government is the only thing, the only policy that has ever worked to reverse these decades of social stress that so many indigenous communities, not only in the US and Canada, but all around the world, have suffered under. Now, what are the alternatives? I'm going to contrast two approaches. One I'm going to call the standard approach, and one the nation-building approach. I'm going to like the second one, and I'm going to try to convince you that the first one is a piece of junk. All right? What's the standard approach? Here's the standard approach to native nation, indigenous nation development. It involves short-term, it's short-term with no strategic thinking. I guess my thing is over here. Where am I? It follows a flavor of the month approach. What grant can we land now? I'll give you a perfect illustration. In my early days in this, I was working, going out to visit a tribe on the south rim of the Grand Canyon down in the southern part of the United States, the beautiful Grand Canyon. It's a tribe called Hualapai. This is dry desert country. The ground is so hard, I've seen kids just skateboard across the ground because the ground is it's like cement, it's smooth and perfect. I arrive at the tribal headquarters, and you know a tribe is in trouble with the standard approach when this is what happens. I pull up in my rental car, out comes their economic development planner, and he's all excited. He just can't wait to greet me. Joe, he says, I just landed a wonderful grant to build 12 miles of cement sidewalks. Well, I tried to paint a picture. You might guess from what I said earlier, this is a place where you don't really need sidewalks. there's actually no neighborhoods where you would put them. It's kind of like sidewalks to nowhere. Why did he do it? Because the tribal council said, you got to go get a grant, and while those sidewalks are being constructed, a few jobs would be created, and that's what it was all about. Land a grant, create a few jobs, desperation. Planning, not for 7 generations, not for 7 months. Planning just the next grant, the next thing that whatever the feds might be funding. Under this standard approach, there's more concern for starting programs and businesses than with sustaining them. Vice Chief here. Vice Chief gets to be there the day the ribbon is cut and they open the new operation. He's likely to be out of office when it falls apart. The standard approach has this very short-term perspective. Not that you want that, but that's what happens, unfortunately, to so many communities. It's looking for short-term fixes instead of long-term strategic thinking. And it just chases funding, but never asks, what kind of community are we trying to build? What kind of community are we trying to build? This is a policy of dependency. This is a policy of dependency. What's the tribal or band council's planning process? We say it has 5 steps in this standard approach. Under the standard approach, you tell the tribal planner and program directors to identify projects and funding. Go look for funding. I don't care if it's sidewalks, a new health clinic, whatever it is, go look for funding. Apply for outside grants and respond to outside initiatives. Notice where the priorities are being called. Oh, this year they're funding sidewalks. Next year it's motels. The year after that it's who knows what. You then, the third step is whatever you find the money for, that's what you start. And then you appoint your political supporters or relatives to run the projects and programs that you can fund. And finally, the tribal or band council micromanages everything to make sure that they got the right contractor for the cement on the sidewalks. I presented this slide a number of years ago here in Saskatchewan to a gathering of FSIN chiefs. And a gentleman from the back raised his hand, Joe, you forgot something. There's a 6th step. He says, it's not a 5-step process, it's a 6-step process. We said, pray about what? Pray you're out of office when it falls apart. What's the role of non-Indian governments in this strategy? You might have been in charge of building the sidewalks. Is that true self-government? Not really, because the non-Indian governments are deciding the priorities. Down in the States, we have these repetitive cycles where first it's light manufacturing. And so the federal government funds all these sort of light manufacturing plants. And then they fall apart. And then the next administration, oh, it's tourism. And then we fund motels and hotels. And they last for 10, 12 years, and then they fall apart. It's just cycle after cycle of non-Indian governments calling the priorities for what your reserve is going to look like. The non-Indian governments fund development of their projects and programs. They ultimately retain veto power over community decisions. No, we said sidewalks. You can't apply that to build the new ambulance center for your health clinic. You have to do sidewalks. Non-Indian governments design and impose the evaluation criteria. Usually, did you spend the money on time? Not did it really help the community? And non-Indian governments seek to avoid public embarrassment rather than risk success. Finally, the non-Indian governments are accountable to their bosses and budgets rather than to the Indian nation that they're supposedly serving. The standard approach, it sees native culture as an obstacle. This is a quote from the United States, the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1969. There was the equivalent of the Royal Commission that you had here in Canada. There was a big Royal Commission, a presidential commission in the US, and it was looking at the poverty on our reservations in the US, and this was the central conclusion, one of the central conclusions. of that study. What does that say? I treat you like students. You got to answer my questions now. What's that say? Anybody? It's a little nerdy way to say it. You Indians will develop as soon as you're like the white guys, as soon as you give up your indigeneity. Okay? We actually find, with hard statistical evidence, that that's actually backwards. We find that under systems of true self-government, any indicator we can find, such as rate of native language use in the home, is strongly positively correlated with performance of that tribe. In other words, native culture turns out, and we can show you the statistical evidence, to run businesses better the stronger their native culture. They run housing departments better the stronger their native culture. They run just about everything better. When they are in the driver's seat, native culture is an asset, not a liability. You don't have to give up indigeneity to develop, and to develop in a way that fits the community's values, needs, and circumstances. The standard approach views native culture only as a resource that can be sold. It's nice, I've got native friends who are artists, it's wonderful, they're glad it works. But is that all that culture's about? Or should culture come into play when you're having your discussions at FSIN about whether you should take that grant to build sidewalks? Obviously, if you can have culture in there expressing the values of the community, you might have a better shot at success in self-governing yourselves. The standard approach doesn't see native culture as an asset in building, organizing, managing, leading, and governing. Our evidence says it is. I'll show you some of that evidence in a moment. What are the typical results of the standard approach? Well, under the standard approach, you end up with failed enterprises, projects, and programs. You end up with a politics of spoils and favorites. My relatives get to run the sidewalk project because they're my relatives, even though they don't know a damn thing about pouring concrete. You end up with a brain drain. The best and the brightest leave. The best and the brightest leave. Because there's instability here. You don't know what's going to get funded. You don't know what your whole community is going to be about because you're just going on somebody else's funding cycles. And so the best and the brightest say, hey, wait a minute, I can't raise a family in this situation. I can't do this. I'm going to leave. I've got a classic story. I work a great deal with the Crow tribe of Montana, about 800 kilometers south of here, due south. Crow tribe of Montana, very well known actually, I'll talk more about them in a moment, for strong support for education. Young woman goes to university, gets a degree in accounting, and faces a choice as she comes out with her accounting degree. Go work at Walmart in Billings, Montana, go work for her tribe. She'd be a real asset for that tribe. She believes in her people. She goes and works for the tribe. 2.25 years into it, can't take it anymore. She says, I've got 2 kids. We got to work. We got to eat. I can't live on the political whim of whether my uncle is in office or not. I'm out of here. She goes to work for Walmart. You get a brain drain. You get a brain drain under this system. Continuing poverty. I don't have to stress that. And importantly, outside perceptions of incompetence and chaos that undermine self-rule and self-determination. That is, all the stereotypes. Oh, those Indians can't run anything. And it's a product of the standard approach. Perhaps even worse is inside perceptions of the same thing. The teenagers growing up thinking, nothing works around here. We tried factory, we tried a motel, we tried cement sidewalks, we tried all. It's this cycle that's destructive of the fabric of a community, destructive of a fabric of a community. So I don't have a lot nice to say about the standard approach. And yet, if you look back since about 1880s, for 130, 40 years, it's kind of been the approach. It's kind of been the approach. And the system is so insidious because people are desperate. hanging on, looking for that money to be able to feed themselves and so forth. It just keeps repeating itself. It keeps repeating itself in these cycles of poverty, social distress, the destruction of the inner fabric of a community. So what's the alternative? We call it the nation-building approach. We call it the nation-building approach. And what do we mean by it? It's what I said before. We mean true self-government. The implementation of self-determined, collective, meaning group, decisions reflecting each indigenous community's own values, needs, and circumstances, made through and implemented by institutions of self-rule designed by that community and run by that community. So what's the nation-building approach look like in action? I took you on a quick tour of the standard approach. I'm going to give you a couple stories. Here's a case of nation-building. You might think about what I'm about to talk about. Well, you have to have some resources and stuff to start. This place that I'm going to talk about now, Citizen Potawatomi Nation had nothing to start with about 35 years ago. These are Potawatomis. They were part of the 3 council fires here in Canada with Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomis. And there's still Potawatomis, for example, at Caldwell Lake and so forth. They were forced south. And this nation, Citizen Potawatomi Nation, was forced 3 or 4 times and eventually pushed down into Oklahoma. Someone was mentioning that around here with the powwows, there are a lot of Oklahomans. Well, it's because there's some of this history. They still have roots in Canada. And here's the story of Citizen Potawatomi. This is a picture from, I think, 1977 or something like that. And you are looking at basically the entire assets of this nation at that time. This is all documented. You can Google on their website. It's a great website, and you can see all this. They had 2.5 acres of land, that little cornfield right behind that building. That house trailer is their tribal headquarters. And they had $550 in the bank. 2.5 acres of land, a house trailer, and $550. That was them. That was what they were. This nation in the 1930s, during the famous Dust Bowl of the 1930s, which hit the southern United States and basically hit Indians and non-Indians alike, basically forced people in an agricultural economy to leave. And they moved off to Chicago to work in factories, and they moved off to Bakersfield, California to pick oranges and so forth and so on in the 1930s. This tribe had been cast to the wind. Literally by the Dust Bowl. The chairman of the tribe is fond of pointing out that the picture there, his name is Rocky Barrett, he's on our advisory board. Rocky says, those are the 3 worst cars ever built. There's a Ford Pinto, that's the one with, you hit it in the rear end, it would explode. An AMC Gremlin and a Dodge Dart, the 3 worst cars ever built. If you look very closely on the right-hand side of the house trailer, there's a little brown mark there. That's actually a patch on the side of the trailer. The citizens of this tribal nation in those years called their tribal headquarters the boxing ring. Here's why it was the boxing ring. Talk about good government. They would every quarter have a quarterly general council meeting, and whoever was in office as tribal chief and vice chief would get impeached and removed. And the new people would elect themselves, and they'd come in and they'd kick people out. And usually there'd be a fist fight in there, in the boxing ring, because you're not getting me out. Well, one time, apparently an elderly gentleman, his tribal chief at the time, and Dad, his son is on council, Dad, they're coming to get us. They've just kicked us out of office. And Dad dove out the side of the house trailer. So the patch on the side of the house trailer is because Dad was escaping being beaten up, okay? Well, this is at about 1977. This is the Citizen Potawatomi Nation today. The Citizen Potawatomi Nation is approaching 20,000 acres of land. It is the largest employer by a long ways in its region of central or Shawnee, Oklahoma. What did they do? They own a bank. They started with $550, 2.5 acres, okay? They bought a bank, and there are now banks all over Oklahoma where they are, and most of the customers of the bank have no idea that it's owned by an Indian nation, They built the equivalent of a Sam's Club, a Costco, one of these big warehouse food stores. that's vertically integrated into their own farms. So they're selling their own beef, their own lettuce, their own vegetables through their what's called Fire Lake Discount Foods. They're very proud of that. It holds the record for the largest sales of soda pop in any 4-day period in the history of any outlet in Oklahoma. I'll tell you why in a minute. They sold the most soda pop of anybody ever. Okay, I'll tell you why in a minute. What have they done? They're developing economically. They plow the money back into the community. They plow the money back into the community. I think it's the same here in Canada from the research we've done. One of the things that our Indian Health Service in the US has just been horrible at is dental care. Dental care isn't very sexy when you go to the national legislature and Congress and try to get your funding. And so they invest their money where it's needed. They also build veterans facilities and elder care facilities and new ball fields. They plow the money back into the community. They just bought a railroad. This is a tribe that started with $550 and 2.5 acres and a house trailer. They just bought a railroad. Interestingly enough, and we're seeing this again and again under this nation-building approach, that economic development that they brag about is restoring the culture of the community. Here's their version of that. They started making money. They started putting on some of the best powwows in the Southern Plains. And I had friends from Canada, from the US, they'd all go to Citizen Potawatomi in September, early September, for the big powwow because they paid the best prize money and they were great powwows. Their own citizens came to them and said, remember, these are citizens who had been cast out across the United States everywhere. Their own citizens come to them and say, you know, council, the powwow is kind of cool and it's making us famous, but, you know, we don't really participate much in our own powwows, and couldn't we do something better with this money? And the tribe has created what they call the family reunions. And every Labor Day weekend, and the first weekend of September, they have these big ball fields, and they've installed electrical and water outlets for the RVs, the recreational vehicles. And all these citizens from all over the US and Canada come home for the family reunions, And that's where they sold the most soda pop, is they get thousands, 13,000 people typically will show up for their family reunions. Interestingly enough, if you go to their website, they have a map of their territory now, their current nation. Click on it, and up pops a map of the United States. They have created districts all over the United States. They go out and rent office buildings for council meetings. They have a central district in Oklahoma. They have a round room with big screens. And if I'm tribal chief, I say, I'll recognize the councilwoman from Sacramento, California, please. And they're conducting, why are they doing this? They wish everyone, but their reality for them, their indigenous history was the Dust Bowl that spread them out. But to bring everybody back together, they not only govern across the entire United States, they provide all of their services across the United States. So if I want dental care and I'm a Potawatomi living in California or Chicago or wherever, I can go get support from my tribe. Here's another case. In Canada, some of us were joking, we all have the same list. There's a set of First Nations. I just picked one of them. There are many of them, increasing numbers, fortunately. But here's just one of them, Membertou, over on the far northeast tip of Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. Membertou First Nation in Canada. They found themselves in the early 1990s in deep financial difficulty. Several $1 million of debt, and just wallowing. And I've been told this story, and I hope it's true, but this is the story I'm told. They tell this story one time, I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name. Anyway, one of the chiefs there, he says to me, one time they're in a council meeting, this is back in the early 90s, they're in a council meeting, and nothing's happening, and they're in financial difficulty, and they're in the standard approach, just chasing the next grant from Diane at the time, trying to get money out of the feds. And an elderly council member sitting in the council, and they have windows like this, and he looks out, and they're starting to hear this nation-building theme a little around, and the elderly council member looks out, and there's a corner like that at the highway on the street, And the story I've been told is he looks and he says, you know, red isn't our color for stop. They got up, apparently, got some paint cans, and went and repainted the stop sign in front of their tribal offices. And they say from that moment forward, we started to move forward. From that moment forward. And what did they do? They took a number of steps. They started to assert their Section 35 rights of inherent self-governance, their treaty rights and so forth, and they started just doing things like repainting the stop sign because they said, this is our territory. We are the government here. They adopted an overall strategy, creating a development corporation, financial planning and so forth. They got themselves certified by this national certification organization that allowed them to do a lot of very innovative businesses. And they were able to launch an entire sort of panoply of programs, economic development efforts, and so forth. This is their current trade and convention center. They're very proud of, they now fight with somebody, maybe in Saskatchewan, for hosting the Aboriginal National Hockey Finals. This is their entertainment center, they call it, at Membertou. And they brought the culture back together. What have they done? Well, they now provide a whole panoply of services: social services, finance, education, human resources, public works, natural resources. They have their own laws for everything, from animal control, dog leash laws, and trash collection, to education and fishery management. They passed their own laws. And in the first 10 years, they've now gone far beyond this. In the first 10 years, they grew dramatically in their number of employees. They raised their budget from $4 million to $65 million, and they became a regional economic and political and cultural powerhouse. A word about this. In each of these stories of nation building, you can see economic development is going hand in hand. These are places that start to boom economically. There are some underlying reasons for that, which I'll touch on in a moment, but I want to make a comment. We had, I think, Robin McClay, who's here visiting us, former student. He remembers this. I had the chief of one of these tribes, Chief Philip Martin of one of these very successful tribes, come, and this is a tribe in Mississippi that in the 1960s was maybe the poorest group of people in North America. They were hiding out in the swamps of Mississippi to avoid federal detection. And then by the early 1980s, they started to break out, and by the mid-1990s, they were the second largest employer in the state of Mississippi. When you go to, what is it, Hortons, Tim Horton, and get a plastic fork or spoon, you're probably using a native product. They have a virtual monopoly on plastics manufacturing of things like forks and spoons for fast food restaurants. They make plastics for General Motors and Ford. You know how the inside of most of our cars now it's almost all plastic? That you're often driving in a product made by an Indian tribe in Mississippi, the Mississippi Choctaw. Interesting. So the Mississippi Choctaw walk around and everybody wears a pin. Indian and non-Indian. They employ 5,000 white and black workers on reserve for their jobs every day. I've been there on a weekday, and there was a traffic jam this morning as all these workers came onto the reserve for their jobs. Why do they employ 5,000 white and black workers? Because every Choctaw who wants a job has a job. There's full employment. And every employee, white, black, American Indian, has a button, and it says, Mississippi Choctaw, sovereign and proud of it. I had this gentleman, he's now deceased, a wonderful, wonderful man and one of my mentors, come speak one time at the university. And two of my Harvard students, non-Indian students, who don't have any stereotypes in their minds, because they're Harvard students, don't have any stereotypes in their minds, raised their hands. Chief Martin, what's all this economic development doing to Choctaw culture? And this is a deep question. I see we have a PhD student here. I saw you introduce yourself. These are deep questions that PhD students, we could fill this room with. What does modern economic development do to indigenous culture? And Chief Martin gave the smartest answer I've ever heard to the question. He probably should have gotten a PhD on the spot, for his brilliance. Here's what he said. And I'll mess up his deep Mississippi drawl, you know, that southern U.S. accent. He thought for a while about the question, what's all this economic development doing to Choctaw culture? And he said, well, I don't know. It used to be everybody moved away, and now they're coming home. What he was trying to say was, don't tell me what to do. We're going to build a community where my people want to live and can live. And sure enough, you see the resurgence of native language. It's one of the tribes in the United States. With all the economic development, go down to the factories where they're building the interiors for Ford and General Motor cars, and everybody's yammering away in Choctaw because they're recovering their language. And I can't understand a word of Choctaw, okay? By the way, I picked up the Cree broadcast last night of the hockey game. It was really cool. I didn't understand a word, but I thought it was awfully cool. And I heard some of you say they were talking Cree so fast nobody could hear him. He was going so fast. You know, those hockey players. So these are examples of the nation-building approach. These are examples of the nation-building approach. Does it really work? For the academics in the audience, I won't belabor it, but I'll show you a little bit of the statistical evidence, if you will. We look in the United States first. I'll show you Canada in a moment. In the United States, self-determination or self-government is known down there. We fly under the flag of sovereignty as opposed to the inherent right. It's a slightly different language. It's the same idea. Okay? The dawn of the modern era of self-determination and self-governance started really in the 1980s. And prior to the 1980s, real incomes on American Indian reservations were actually declining. People were getting poorer all through the 70s and 80s, all through the 70s and 80s. We get into self-determination in the sort of mid-80s, and it starts to take off. For the United States as a whole, over the decade from 1990 to 2000, per capita, per person income, average American, U.S. citizen of any race, saw an 11% increase in per capita income. What happened in Indian country under self-determination in that decade? Among the gaming tribes, tribes with casinos, maybe not surprising, their incomes grew 3 times more rapidly than the average in the United States. There was an economic boom going on. Now the telling evidence, though, comes from the tribes without casinos. Everyone thinks, well, there's casinos. They grew almost as fast, about 3 times faster, because the casino revolution was just the tip of a sovereignty or self-governing iceberg. It was one of the ways, but not the only way in which people took control of their own affairs. In addition to casinos, they built manufacturing plants to build plastics, to make plastics, to do all kinds of things. And so we saw this boom once self-determination or self-governance started to take hold in the states. When we go the next decade, we go the next decade, from 1990 to 2010, over those 20 years of self-determination, and this is our latest systematic data from our 2010 census, reservation incomes grew 5 times faster than incomes in the rest of the United States. There is an economic boom going on across Indian America in the U.S. What's it look like in the case of Canada? What's it look like in the case of Canada? A little harder to get a handle on it. Self-governance here has taken some different forms, but some First Nations, as you know, are really pushing the boundaries. I showed you for Membertou and others. And some interesting research looking at the combination of the impacts of self-governance and comprehensive land claim settlements. So you both get self-governance and control over a geographic area, a comprehensive land settlement. It's one thing to have self-governance, but if you don't have any land over which you can exercise your jurisdiction, you're not really governing. But if you can get both, then perhaps you actually can get on this nation-building bandwagon. And here's what we find. For those First Nations in Canada that got both a comprehensive self-governance and a comprehensive land claim settlement agreement, in the first decade, or the first census after that occurs, you see about a 14% increase in people's incomes relative to First Nations that didn't get self-governance and land, okay? In the second decade, you see another kick, and overall, over those 2 decades, you see about a 35% increase in incomes of these First Nations who got self-governing powers over their own lands relative to First Nations who did not. This is kind of some evidence then that this works, that this strategy works. I will comment again on this notion of true self-government. Go on the website, Google on the phrase rebuilding grants, federal Canada. And they have rebuilding nation grants. They get the word from Megan and the Harvard Project, okay? That's the standard approach. Here, come get a grant and be self-governing. No. Be self-governing by making your own laws on everything from controlling the dogs to what's taught in the schools, to what form of government you have. On the same theme, the research finds that when First Nations or U.S. tribes take over policing on their own reserves, own reservations, you find through surveys that citizens feel they are better treated, especially that they are treated by more respect when they are hired, when the people that are their police, they've hired themselves. Often in the States, when a tribe takes over its police force, it's the same individuals on Monday are working for our federal police. The tribe takes over, and on Tuesday the tribe is hiring the same people. It's the same human beings, yet they behave in different ways. They behave in different ways because they're now accountable home, not somewhere off in Ottawa or Washington, D.C. In a study of about, I think it's 110 tribes that have taken over the management of their forestry operations, tribes compared to tribes that do not take over management of their own forestry operations, which means everything from running the auctions to scoring, grading the trees and so forth. The tribes that take over experience holding, for the statisticians and economist types in the audience, holding constant the quality of the forest, the prices of logs and so forth. They get 11% more out of their forest without violating so-called allowable cut. In other words, without any additional environmental damage. Why? You talk to the workers and they say, well, now we work for our own people. We do a better job of picking up the stuff we wouldn't pick up before. Just literally that simple. And lastly, we've done studies looking at health and in federally run clinics versus clinics that are taken over by the First Nations or the tribes. And what we find is objectively waiting times go down. And any of you who've had to deal with your federally provided Indian health services, you know you can wait forever. So it's kind of an easy target to get waiting times down. But again, it's the same people, same human beings, but they're now working under their own governments, their own people's control. What are the keys to successful nation building? What are the keys to successful nation building? I'm going to throw out 3 keys. I won't tell my Newt Gingrich joke. I'm going to throw out 3 keys to nation building. It's embarrassing. It's got to be harder than three things. You know, it's got to be harder to create a healthy nation than what I'm about to do. But what I'm going to show you is what we see as the common pattern. What we see as the common pattern. And the first is something we call the sovereignty attitude. You know, as a nerdy professor, we have to publish or perish. Publish and perish is what it feels like when you're up at 2:30 in the morning writing and you're tired. We have to publish and perish. We publish peer-reviewed articles that call this not the sovereignty attitude, but the kick-ass attitude. Okay? Also sometimes called the Nike strategy. What's Nike's slogan? Just do it. Okay? Here's the Nike strategy. And these successful tribes that I'm talking about, are tribes that are doing this. This is a tribe in central Arizona, Western Apache. They have a beautiful lake called Holly Lake. Here's the quick story of, they're now, you'll see in a moment, they've taken off, right? Back in the 1960s, or actually right after World War II, the federal government, in control of all the resources, leased land to rich dentists and doctors from Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona to go build their summer cabins around this beautiful lake. And back in the 1940s, an acre of land was like $17 a year to lease it, okay? The leases had 20-year terms, and in 1967, the leases all came up. And all these rich doctors and lawyers had their beautiful summer cabins, summer homes up around on the banks of this lake. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs walks into the tribal offices with a set of leases, plops them on the tribal chief's desk, and they're all signed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and by the homeowner, and now they just need the tribe to sign on them. So, Mr. Chief, just sign these, would you? Just sign these, please. He thumbs through them. They were going to renew the leases. You want to guess what rate they were going to renew it at? $17. Okay. Well, by the mid-1960s, this land was worth thousands of dollars. The tribe said no, and literally had an armed showdown where they blocked the road that comes down a little narrow canyon to get into that lake. And they had an armed showdown, said, we're not going to sign these things, and they won. Okay, and they won. And they took control of their own property. And from that point forward, the tribe takes off. They didn't start with any money. They started with attitude. They started with attitude. The next fight they had was elk hunting. The U.S. Constitution, don't have to bore you with it, says that U.S. tribes, that state governments, your provincial governments, state governments don't have jurisdiction over commerce on reserve. Tribe reads the U.S. Constitution, it says that. They say, you're selling state game and fishing licenses and hunting licenses, and we want to. And they kick the state government off, and they go all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and they win. And they win. And when I was a little boy, I grew up in Arizona, not far from here. I could go hunting there for $15. Okay? Now, if any of you would like to go elk hunting up there, you can join Jack Nicklaus, the golfer, and his sons, George Strait, the country music singer, the so-called corporate suite, C-suite, top brass of Coca-Cola, and pay $40,000 to go elk hunting because they have the finest game management we can find anywhere. And I won't bore you with the statistics. I know statistics now on like body fat of pregnant elk. Okay, they have the healthiest elk anyone can find. They do the finest management. Okay, but they do it on their own terms. They do it on their own terms. The tribe then goes and creates a ski resort after a big fight with the Sierra Club. The environmentalists didn't want them to. They did it their own way. There are two mountains side by side, Mount Baldy and Sunrise Peak. Their ski resort is on Sunrise Peak. And if you say to them, why isn't it on Mount Baldy? Well, we would never put it on Mount Baldy. That's sacred to us. They did it on their own terms. They weren't against having a ski resort, but they weren't going to put it on their sacred mountain. They wanted it on their own. They wanted it on their own terms. The last bit of the story. This is this gruesome bug-looking military helicopter. It's called the Apache helicopter. It's made about 200 kilometers southwest of this tribe. One day they say, they're using our name. This is this kick-ass attitude. They're using our name. They get the tribal elected officials, council, get in their cars and trucks and drive down to Phoenix, Arizona, walk into the offices of McDonnell Douglas Boeing and say, you're using our name. We want some jobs. And okay, and they end up making parts for those military helicopters. Here's another example of this kick-ass attitude. Oops, I'm going to jump ahead of this one because I'm running out of time. Here's the sovereignty attitude. A good friend of mine for many, many years, Mike Mitchell. Some of you may know Mike. He's now elder at AFN. For years, he's been faithkeeper and then Grand Chief of Akwesasne Mohawk. I was just with Mike last week in some meetings, and he told this story again. Here's the story of Akwesasne Mohawk, their sort of takeoff moment. They're having all kinds of trouble with their own people getting arrested for fishing in the St. Lawrence River, by Ontario Game and Fish or whatever the authorities are, for not having licenses. And the tribe says that we don't have licenses. We have a treaty. This is our land. And they get in one of the classic treaty fights. They get in a classic treaty fight. Well, they're going back and forth like this. Mike gets it in his head. I'll tell you what. We're going to pass our own game and fish law, and then we're going to arm our own game and fish officers. Sends a group of his police to Canada won't take them. Sends them across the border into the state of New York. And they go to the State Police Academy and get trained to exactly the same standards as the Canadian and U.S. authorities. Come back, he arms them with 357 magnums or 44 magnums, and gives them the right to issue tickets and makes arrests, and they take control over their own fishing on the river. They fight with Ontario for months and months, and gradually Ontario comes around and says, well, are you enforcing your law? Yeah. Well, maybe what we could do is recognize you as like cross-deputies of us. In other words, by asserting your rights of self-government and then doing it well, going through all the right training, all of that, suddenly Ontario backs off and the tribe has jurisdiction over it. And arming those officers, Mike tells me, and perhaps you know, sir, but Mike tells me that that's the first time anybody in Canada had actually armed their officers for such a purpose successfully. And now it's set a precedent for all of Canada. And today, Akwesasne Mohawk is famous for having this soup to nuts laws, from estate planning laws for elderly people, to pet control laws, to tax law, and so forth and so on. That's the sovereignty attitude. But the sovereignty attitude isn't enough. How am I doing on time, Candace? Yeah, okay. I'm having fun. I like this audience. I'm having fun. All right. Okay. The sovereignty attitude, you can have all of that attitude you want, and you can walk like you're cool. Okay. You want to see me do that? You can walk like you're cool. And then if you can't, you can assert your rights of self-governance. Fight mightily to reestablish them and take them back under what I believe is an inherent right. Forget what any law says. It's a human right to me. And then get those rights and fall flat on your face if you can't exercise them well. So what we find with these successful tribes, is they have lots of that attitude. They back it up with the ability to govern themselves and govern themselves well. Here's a story. Crow Tribe of Montana. Crow Tribe of Montana, maybe the wealthiest natural resource community in the world. Just down there in central Montana, south of here, they have coal, oil and gas, coal bed methane, other minerals. We once forced the federal government to do an asset inventory. In today's dollars, they've probably got about $80 billion to $90 billion worth of natural resource wealth for about 13,000 people. They own more coal. They're like 9th in the world after Czech Republic and before Poland or something in terms of their coal. They also have a deep respect in their culture for education. It goes back, I won't dwell on it, but it goes back to traditional chiefs within the community preaching education. There's a famous line in Crow culture: without education, you are his victim. With education, you are his equal, meaning white. Deep respect for education. You walk in their offices and there's PhDs and there's MBAs and there's lawyers and there's accountants. They have a coal mine on their reservation that they make some money off of. And they have 75% unemployment. They have simmering political violence. They have suicide rates 5 to 8 times the national average. It is a desperate place. All the natural resources of the world, all the education in the world. You peel back the cover and ask what's happening. Here's what happens. In 1948, a non-Indian attorney wrote them a constitution at Crow. And here's their constitution. It has only 3 main clauses. It says every adult member of the tribe is a member of the tribal council. 13,000 people, 7,000 adults, 7,000 member tribal council. Quorum is 100 people. Quorum is 100 people. One of the people who worked for us, worked for Megan a number of years ago, was a member of this tribe, and she says, Joe, I don't even have to go past my first cousins and I've got a quorum of 100 people. Okay, quorum is 100 people. 3rd clause of the Constitution. The council shall meet on the 1st Saturday of every quarter. So 1st Saturday in January, 1st Saturday in April, July, October. Basically, end of Constitution. What's it feel like to you? Mob rule. And here's the way it works. Between 1967 and 2001, not a single tribal chair, as they call it, their chief, was elected and finished out a term of office without being impeached and removed. Not a single one finished a term of office. The last 3 prior to 2001, when they finally changed their constitution, the last 3 prior to 2001 were convicted federal felons while in office, the tribal chairs. One of them, a woman named Claire Nomi, had to walk around with a Martha Stewart bracelet. Her penalty or whatever was she had to stay on reserve, and so she had to walk around with the GPS bracelet on her ankle, so not able to leave the reserve. Well, imagine not only what economic development, but any development. Imagine what a housing program looks like in this kind of situation. There was a tradition at Crow, they talk about it, where you'd get kicked out of office, at that last election that Saturday. It's the next Saturday, and here come the people to kick you out, physically out of the office. You would come in with all your friends and relatives in their pickup trucks and you're the one being kicked out of office. You'd come in with your friends and relatives in their trucks, box up every piece of paper in the office and leave with it. So that the new tribal chair who would come in would find nothing in the office. No record of that negotiation with the federal government over a casino, no record of that grant that you were getting, you hoped, for the new housing and so forth. This was chaos. And you watch the killing of a country, in a sense. You watch the killing of a country. It's somewhat telling that their constitution, their form of government, was written by a non-Indian lawyer from the immediate off-res town, because the off-res community wanted them to be in chaos. They had all these resources, and man, you wanted corruption, you wanted chaos, because that's how, if you were an outsider, that's how you got a hold of that grazing land, of those oil and gas resources, and so forth. So, the second key is capable institutions. I don't have a cute phrase like kick-ass, okay? This is kind of a nerdy phrase. Well, you got to be able to run things well. There's at least 2 dimensions to this. There are at least 2 dimensions to this. One is just another really sexy phrase, managerial, just getting the paper filed and things run well. What do we mean by it? Here's an interesting story. This is a woman, she's a police sergeant at a tribe in Arizona called Gila River. The G is pronounced like an H, Gila River. And here's the quick story of managerial effectiveness. They take over their police department. On Monday, it's a federally run police department, and on Tuesday, it's run by the tribe. Prior to taking over, all documented, the average response time for an emergency vehicle was something like 1 hour and 10 minutes. This is a big rural reservation. A lot of people die in 1 hour and 10 minutes from a heart attack or an auto accident or whatever. Okay? They take over, and within 6 months, they have emergency response down under 10 minutes. Same people, same human beings, just working in a different way. Managerial effectiveness, we asked them why, and the best explanation they can come up with is, well, under the federal rules, cops couldn't take their patrol cars home. They had to go park them at a central place down near where the tribal headquarters are every night. Well, you're in a big rural reservation. If you could have your cars spread out a little bit, and there's an auto accident, you have a much better chance of getting there quickly for whatever accident might have occurred, or a stroke or a heart attack or whatever it might have been. And they just changed the rule. Cops, you can take your cars home at night. And they just did a better job. Here's a Soyuz run by a wonderful gentleman named Clarence Louie. I know Clarence very well. Managerial effectiveness. He's got signs all over the place. You can see a sign on the side of his building. This is a quite aggressive nation-building tribe, or First Nation band in British Columbia. You go into his office. There's a sign on his desk. You know the phrase "Indian time." You're going to show up. Everybody shows up late. On his desk is "Indian time is on time." He's just trying to change a pattern of behavior that wasn't indigenous. It had to do with a system that wanted people to be dependent. It was a system intentionally designed with its institutions to make you dependent on the band government, to make you dependent. One more quick one. This is a nursing home in Arizona run by the Tohono O'odham Nation. Tohono O'odham runs a beautiful nursing home. It was the first 5-star certified, the highest level of certification, higher than anything else, including the richest communities in the state of Arizona. And you go to this place, and it's this fabulous healthcare and cultural center somehow at the same time, where people who have the finest in healthcare, elderly people who used to get shipped off to Phoenix or Tucson, Arizona, and deep in that culture. Why'd they do it? Deep in the culture, there's a doctrine called hymdog. And hymdog, part of it is, it's a big thing, part of it is, as people get elderly and are approaching death, you gather the family around them. You gather the family around them. So this was an act of cultural restoration to build a health clinic. And a fascinating story about managerial effectiveness, the woman who, Frances Stout, who was the chair of the board and really founder of the organization, member of the tribe, had been a big-time nurse running hospitals, administrative nurse running hospitals in Phoenix. She retires, she's comes home and built this, and she tells the following story. She says, we planned it perfectly. We only misestimated one thing. We underestimated the amount of toilet paper we needed by a factor of 3. Huh? Why? She knew how to run toilet paper. It's because all the families would come and stay all day. And so grandma or grandpa's there, and the whole family would come because it's deep in the culture that people come. And if they're going to stay, they're going to use toilet paper. And so the point of this is these are examples of extremely well-run operations. But it's not all about just managerial effectiveness. It's ultimately about this, or better yet, this. Who's this guy right here? Who is that? It's Johnny Depp, Pirates of the Caribbean. He is the scourge of nation building and economic development all over the world. You guys didn't know that, but don't buy his movies. He's killing people's lives, okay? What do I mean by this? We're talking about what we call political piracy. Political piracy. We human beings need government all over the face of the earth. Actually, here in Canada, up in far northern Saskatchewan. We're talking like this, and we're talking about people need government. And an elderly gentleman, an elder, says, you know, even wolves have government. And what he meant was, people have to organize themselves. And we organize ourselves to do things like pick up the trash and determine what the speed limit will be so people don't get killed and, you know, build schools and these kinds of things. This is what we do as human beings all over the face of the earth. It's not a mystery. But we got this one big problem. It's called political piracy. And you can now start thinking of your favorite pirates, like in Venezuela, for example. Here's the problem. You create, at least under self-rule, institutions. How do you keep the people who get the power to be the decision makers at any time, how do you keep them from using that power to just benefit themselves or their family or their faction or their party? How do we get them to not just use the power of government for their own benefit, but use it for the community's benefit? And this is what we call political piracy. Political pirates come in many forms. Anybody know who this is? 2,500 pairs of shoes. This is Imelda Marcos in the Philippines, and her husband, Ferdinand. The 2,500 pairs of shoes were cheap compared to the $5 billion that they had in Swiss banks, ripping off the Philippines, the president of the Philippines and his wife, the presidents of the Philippines. Sometimes pirates come in sort of minor doses. You guys have to get, who's that? Anybody know who these guys are? These are 4 Canadian senators: Mike Duffy, Mac Robb, Pamela Wallin, and Peter Brazeau. Peter, is it? Patrick Brazeau. These were these 4 senators a few years ago who were basically charging off expenses, okay, which weren't really work expenses, okay? This guy claims to be the number, he brags about it. He literally has said, I am the wealthiest man in the world because I can get to any wealth I want. I can put my hands on it and grab it. I can put my finger in any pie, okay? He's got a friend apparently who's trying to do some stuff. It's an embarrassing time to be from the U.S., okay? Sorry. All right. A word about what I just showed you. I didn't show you any indigenous leaders. This is not an indigenous problem. This is a human problem. We all see it. It's appointing your cousin to the job. It's a human problem. Or as my friend Perry Bellegarde said to me last week, it's a two-legged problem. We're all part of the two-legged tribe, and this is part of our problem. How do we prevent political piracy? How did these guys do it? Remember, 2.5 acres, $550, house, boxing ring, and now they are this. They went and adopted a Western-looking court system. Appeals, Supreme Court, the whole bit. The president of the tribe, chairman of the tribe, says he knows his court system is working because he's been taken up twice while he's been in office and lost both times and had to abide by the court's decision. We put in this phrase, quintessential Western phrase, checks and balances, trying to stabilize a rule of law instead of rule of law, family politics or party politics. Checks and balances. Does it have to look Western? No. Take a quick second and look at that. This is from the Great Law of Peace. Whoops, that's the wrong one. This is from the Great Law of Peace of the Haudenosaunee. There are Haudenosaunees, Mohawks, Senecas, etc., in Canada and the U.S. I had to look up what contumacious meant. This is obviously a system with a kind of Supreme Court called the Clan Mothers. I usually, if I had time, I'd put up their pictures. They're wonderful women. And at least on the U.S. side at Akwesasne, at St. Regis Mohawk, for example, they're fully operating, where they can take down a vice chief. You know, we upbraid you first. I'm picking on you because you're right there. We can upbraid you first, and if you don't listen to us, then we kick you out of here, okay? You're just watching human societies that work find some way to do this, whether it's Western looking or not. This is a deep lesson that indigenous communities are teaching the rest of the world. The World Bank and others go out and sell a US, Canadian, Western European model of what good government is. It has to achieve the same function of controlling the political pirates, but it doesn't have to look Western in its structure. It doesn't have to look Western in its structure. And across Indian country, we see examples of tribes with various approaches. The bottom one there, the White Mountain Apache, at San Carlos Apache, elderly women. It's a matrilineal, matrilocal society. The grandmas have the finger-wagging capability. They can wag their finger at you. You've been not doing your job in council. You better, no one resists grandma's finger. No one resists grandma's finger. All right. And then I said there's the last key. And it's something we call cultural match. For institutions to work well, they have to be legitimate. To be legitimate in a fundamental way, the structure of power and authority in those institutions has to match the community's underlying norms of what is proper authority, what is proper power in the community, what is proper power in the community. At the Crow tribe of Montana, that tribe that was so troubled, coal and all the resources and horrible living conditions and all of that, they finally changed their constitution. And at the Crow tribe of Montana, they said, a quorum is 100 people and everybody's on our council. That's not our tradition. We had a two-branch government. We had a council of clans and a council of warriors. And in 2001, they put in a government with a strong chief executive. You're the council of warriors. You fly to Washington, D.C. and fight those fights. Council of clans, you are our Senate. And they set up districts. Their clans are still matched to geography within the reservation. They set up 6 districts with 3 representatives from 6, and you suddenly made the clans, those are the clan names in there on the map of their res, you made the most legitimate people in the community suddenly the legislators, and the place has stabilized immediately. They quit kicking people out of office. They're finally attracting jobs because they tapped into the legitimate authority in the community, which for them was these clans. For citizen Potawatomi, that tribe cast to the winds, who adopted a US-style Supreme Court and all that, they'll tell you that that's our culture now. We got cast to the winds. We've grown up for 3 generations. That's all we've known. That'll work for us, and it does work for them. Haudenosaunee, the clan mothers have been revitalized, where they have essentially a finger-wagging authority or more. So cultural match is the 3rd key, and there's a 4th real quickly. One more, leadership. Ultimately, real human beings have to do this, and it takes leadership. And it takes leadership. That leadership does not have to be fancy, doesn't have to come with all the degrees and everything. It might be the elderly grandmas who are the leaders in the community. Or it might be someone like that. Anybody know who that is? Because leaders need to be able to wag their fingers and hold pirates accountable. And of course, that's the now honorably resigned Attorney General of Canada, First Nations woman from British Columbia, Jody Wilson-Raybould. She spoke at Harvard last year for Megan and I at a big program we put on. If I were Trudeau, I wouldn't have been surprised at all. Because from the time she was born, she was a truth teller. That was her job in life. And that's what she does. That's what leadership is about. So I end with that, and just a shout out to the University of Saskatchewan. This Honoring Nations program is part of that leadership. You have the program that we put on back at Harvard. Australia has its own Indigenous governance awards for honoring, as an act of community building and regeneration of nations, these simple acts of self-governance, running things well, running your emergency response well, rewriting your constitution if you have to, okay? And now we get University of Saskatchewan, so a shout out to you guys for stepping up and joining the family, because we think like it's really important, because this notion of nation building is the future of Native nations around the world. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very, very, very much. There's a couple of things that I really enjoyed about this. Wonderful stories. As an economist, wonderful statistics. It's good to see some of that stuff. And exactly. This is Joe and I being nerds. And a wonderful exposition of how theory actually theory and research can go together for understanding these very, very practical problems. And I think this is really at the heart of what I think we are trying to do at the Johnson Cheyenne Graduate School, and what I see happening at the University of Saskatchewan as well. I would like to invite Jackie Ottman, Dr. Jackie Ottman, Vice Provost of Indigenous Engagement, to come up and make some closing remarks. Jackie.
Okay. Just put that down a bit. I always begin by saying, Anin dinamaganak. Hello, all my relations. Mizayak megak mizawek megak bepa modang dizanakas. I shared with you my spirit name, and then I say Ngejikenda Miomayan Kananakamenakanama Miomayat. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm honored by the presence of many. And I do recognize the leaders that are with us online or live, that we're being live streamed, and the leaders that are here with us today. It is, as you could see there, that very last slide really does speak to the opportunity that the University of Saskatchewan has in developing a relationship with Harvard University's Harvard Project, American Indian Economic Development Program. And so After many years of teaching in elementary and high schools and doing a short stint as a principal, I came back to the educational administration program here at the university, did my master's and PhD on the topic of First Nations leadership development. And so there's a reason for that, and that was primarily because I was seeing a lack of literature and research from the perspective of Indigenous peoples in this area of leadership and governance. Because leadership and governance transcends sectors. And so started delving into the literature and whatever I can get my hands on to see, to look for research, to look for exemplars of current Indigenous examples of leadership and governance. And this is where I started reading into what Harvard was doing in terms of their programming. So have been following various aspects of the Harvard program for many years. And so this is very exciting for me to be in this position, to welcome Megan Hill and Joe Kalt to the University of Saskatchewan. It is a bit surreal for me. And so nation building is as you heard today, nation building and self-governance is very powerful. And it has implications for society as a whole. And in Canada, that is something that Indigenous peoples look to the treaties for examples of ways to develop right relations and ways the treaties really do uplift Indigenous or bring Indigenous peoples to a rightful place within society. And so one of the things that we also value is storytelling. And so the Harvard Project allows Indigenous communities, not individuals, but Indigenous communities to share their stories with the nation, with the world. What is working? What has worked? And we can take those stories, those are case studies, and we can learn from them. And we do know that we need more of these kinds of case studies for us to learn from. And another thing that Harvard Project does is celebrate Indigenous community success. And so that is the honoring of uplifting of communities that are engaging in this kind of work. And so we're challenging perceptions just because we are uplifting our forms of success. And we've seen examples from Dr. Kalt's presentation of the weaving of Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of governance and leadership. And so I've studied leadership, I've studied organizational development and change theory, and one thing I do know is after all of that research and exploration and investigation, my definition of leadership is very, very simple. And that's leadership with and by Indigenous peoples done in a good way, right? So it's inclusive, it's empowering. And in a good way, as I've talked about many times, it does have us pay respect and learn from our ancestors so we can understand our current landscape in a much more in-depth way, so we can make informed decisions for those children not yet born 7 generations into the future. It considers our intention, right? And so leadership with and done by Indigenous people, done in a good way. I kind of did mess that one up. But thank you so much for, on behalf of the University of Saskatchewan, for being here today with us. And I had the opportunity of visiting Harvard last October It was we were met with a lot of graciousness, generosity, and it was very, very welcoming for us. And the generosity of spirit in terms of sharing all that the Harvard Project has, I'll say, accumulated, the wealth of knowledge is actually freely given to the University of Saskatchewan if we choose, and if we choose to adapt. And so, as Dr. Kalt has shared in the last slide, we are in that process of considering the possibilities for a partnership between the University of Saskatchewan and the Harvard Project. So that is very, very exciting, and as Murray Fulton had mentioned, that would be in association with Johnson Shoyama. And so we are in exciting times, again, leading in ways that we hope will inspire Indigenous youth and Indigenous communities well into the future. So at this time, we would like to present our elder Roland Duquette. Whenever we sit in a sharing circle, and actually in any circle, and he hears someone that comes from a different country, whether it's Australia or Asia or the United States, he says, you make them feel like they belong. You welcome them into the circle. And so that's what we would like to do today, and is invite Dr. Kalt and Megan Hill to the stage. And in our way, we recognize people by the presentation of a blanket, by wrapping them, embracing them through this gesture, which is symbolic of protection and just really, warmth and security. Really, the symbol that this is security from our home to your home, and so it is a demonstration of community. And also what we've talked about today, it leads to nation building. So thank you, Gitchimigwich, for being with us here today, and for sharing with us the excitement of a possibility, and giving us guidance and wisdom and direction with that. Thank you so much.
Jackie, thank you very much. This now brings us to the end of today's program. Before we go, I too would like to thank Megan, Joe. Thank you both for coming, for all the great work that you've done with us. They have just been absolutely selfless. They've said you can have all these materials about how to run the Harvard Project. They've been more than generous with their time, so I want to thank you both for that and for this wonderful presentation this afternoon. For those of you who are here in Saskatoon, there is a lot of food back here, so please stay, talk to each other, introduce yourself to Megan and to Joe, and really let's have a further conversation about nation building. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.